Today I'm going to be going over the top 5 decks to play right now in Clash Royale. With the current global tournament going on, these decks are your best bets to getting as many wins as possible. So without further ado, let's get right into them. Number 1. Mortar Bait. That's right, Mortar Bait has made its return back into the top of this meta. This deck, as advertised, is all about forcing out your opponent's small spells and overwhelming your opponent with your swarms. However, it is quite versatile, and there are many ways to play this deck depending on the matchup. Starting things off, I'm always going to be a little bit on the aggressive side with this deck. Maybe I'll cycle a mortar at the bridge or some of my cards in the back just to get my opponent to make a response. Depending on the matchup, as well as the cards that the opponent has in hand, there are multiple ways to play your offense. The first is a bait-centered offense, where your opponents may have used some of their small spells or splash units. In this case, getting some of your swarm units down and a miner to tank for your arena tower is going to be very effective at getting damage onto the tower. Alternatively, if the opponent has a lot of weak, swarmy units, then a mortar at the bridge may be your best bet at breaking through to the opponent's tower. Finally, you even have a brute force strategy, with the power of the cannon cart and the skeleton king being able to just smash through your opponent's defenses. On the defensive end, this deck is also insanely effective. Because so many of your units are so weak to small spells, make sure that you're spacing those units apart. You have the cannon cart for some high output damage, the mortar to pull any building targeting units, as well as the skeleton king to do most of your splash damage. Of course, never underestimate the effectiveness of the skeleton king's ability, both on defense as well as on offense, because it kind of serves as an additional bait unit once all of your other swarm troops die. Last thing to note though is that there is no big spell in this deck, so towards the end of the match, try to begin sending in some of those miners to get consistent chip damage onto the opponent's towers. Number 2. Giant Skeleton Goblin Drill. Now this is probably the most popular deck that has popped up in recent times for several reasons. The main one being that it's very good against Electro Giant decks. So if that is your big issue, then this is a good deck for you. Starting off, this deck is a chip style control deck, meaning that you're going to slowly want to chip away at your opponent's tower with your Goblin Drill, your Golden Knight, and your Magic Archer, while holding down solid on the defensive end. Starting off on the defensive end, you have so many options. First off, you have 2 buildings. You have the Tombstone and the Goblin Drill. And even if your opponent's building targeting units make it past both of your buildings somehow, you even have the Tornado to pull those units back away from your arena towers. I mean, if you're talking about a counter to the Electro Giant, this is as good as it's gonna get. Aside from that, you have the Zappies to stall the opponent's pushes, as well as the Golden Knight and Giant Skeleton to just absolutely clog up the lane on defense. What's so great about this deck is that your defensive units are either insanely ranged or insanely tanky, meaning that there will be a high chance that your troops will survive a defense and you'll have a small counter push. In that case, then go ahead and send in your Goblin Drill to the opponent's tower. Try to get a couple of goblins to connect onto the tower, and if that happens, then you've performed a pretty successful push. That being said, you also have a good amount of bridge spam pressure as well with the Giant Skeleton, the Golden Knight, as well as the Goblin Drill. So if the opponent does spend a lot of elixir in the back, definitely feel free to just go ham in the opposite lane. This is another one of those decks that does not have a big spell, so when it gets towards the end of the match and you really want to finish the game off, well then you do have several options. The first is continuing to chip the tower down with your Goblin Drill. It is so difficult to perfectly stop a Goblin Drill, but alternatively, you can use the Tornado along with the Magic Archer or the Golden Knight to get some very sneaky connections onto the opponent's tower. Number 3. Giant Skeleton Hog Cycle. This new Giant Skeleton Hog deck is continuing to dominate this meta, essentially serving as the new 2.6 Hog Cycle deck. This deck is all about fast and high pressure onto your opponents. Starting things off, you're going to always be very aggressive, cycling your Fire Spirits, your Skeletons, or even a Hog at the bridge to begin forcing out a response from your opponent. The whole purpose of this deck is to outcycle your opponent's Hog counters to allow your Hogs to get as many connections onto the tower as possible. In addition, you have the Earthquake, which absolutely disintegrates buildings and can be very, very effectively comboed with that Hog Rider to get those connections as well. Now that being said, the offense of this deck is pretty simple. You either go with the Hog route or you go with the Spell Cycle route with the Earthquake. The defense is where things can get a little bit interesting. Starting off the defense, against most ground-based decks, you're going to have a relatively easy time. The Giant Skeleton is so effective at clogging the lane, and your fast cycle allows you to cycle to multiple cannons as well as multiple Giant Skeletons. So a majority of ground pushes, even those with building targeting units, you're definitely going to have the tools to very easily stop those pushes. The difficulty comes when you're facing an air-based deck. And with this, you have two options. The first is you need to decide whether or not the opponent has an effective way of taking out your Archer Queen. If that is the case, well then your best bet is to cycle your Archer Queen first to get back to an Archer Queen as fast as possible, or pressure the opposite lane with your Giant Skeleton or your Hog Rider. In addition, you can also try to cycle multiple cannons on defense to pull the opponent's Lava Hounds or Balloons, but just keep in mind that the Archer Queen is really your biggest defensive asset. All in all, a fast-paced and high-pressure deck. Just make sure that you're always going to be keeping your opponents on their toes. Number 4, Lava Hound Spam. Now again, Lava Hound is still absolutely dominating this meta. It's an insanely easy deck to play, and it's insanely difficult to stop, so definitely a top choice for this global tournament. Starting things off, I'm going to be playing this deck as an aggressive style of beatdown deck. So you're going to be building pushes very similar to a beatdown deck, and you're going to be very, very aggressive, even going Lava Hound first play if the opponent plays something moderately expensive in the back. Your Lava Hound pushes are going to be pretty simple, but I am going to urge you to not overcommit and go all in on every single one of your Lava Hound pushes. And that is because your Lava Hound pushes are actually quite weak to spells. If you group your units together too much, your opponents are going to get way too much spell value, and that is going to be the one reason that you're going to lose a match with Lava Hound. Instead, I like to build my Lava Hound pushes very slowly, supporting the Lava Hound with one or maybe two of my support units and baiting out my opponent's counters before going all in with the rest of my push. In addition, a neat trick with going Lava Hound in the back is that your opponents are gonna likely pressure the opposite lane, and you can actually just go in with a Mighty Miner on defense, and then once the Mighty Miner is finished on defense, then just pop the Mighty Miner's ability and it'll move to the opposite lane and continue to support your Lava Hound push. The offensive synergy is insane, but moving on to defense, you have a lot of options as well. Because the Mighty Miner kind of serves as your tank killer nowadays, the Inferno Dragon is not seen as often in these types of Lava Hound builds, and that frees you up to include cards such as the Skeleton Dragon and the Mega Minion. And on the defensive end, the whole goal is to stall out the opponent's push with your ground units, while your Mega Minion and your Skeleton Dragons deal most of the damage. All in all, a very fast-paced and easy deck to pick up and play. Number 5. Giant Skeleton Graveyard. Now this deck is the top graveyard deck in the current meta. It is a deck that is very, very heavily based on control, building up an elixir advantage on defense, and forming a giant counter push with all of your heavy units. Starting off the game, I'm going to be pretty passive. Maybe I'll cycle a Tombstone or some Zappies, but aside from that, I'm generally waiting for my opponent to make the first move. After that, the defense of this deck could not be any simpler. You have the Zappies and the Tombstone to stall any sort of push that your opponent has coming your way. You have the Inferno Dragon to take care of any tanks. You have the Skeleton King to deal splash damage, and you have the Giant Skeleton as a lane clogger that'll just blow up all of your opponent's troops. Of course, you can never underestimate the use of your spells on defense as well. The arrows and fireball are going to be insanely clutch, and also never forget a defensive graveyard can be used in an absolute crutch. That being said, however, your Skeleton King does have an ability that kind of serves as that graveyard, so use those defensive graveyards at your own discretion. That being said, after a defense, you'll oftentimes have surviving units, and that is when you can go in with your counter push. The style of your pushes is relatively simple, right? You want to get a tank to tank for the arena tower, while the graveyard spawns skeletons directly on top. This is sort of what makes this graveyard deck so deadly, right? You have a big giant skeleton Skeleton or Skeleton King barreling down your lane and a graveyard on the arena tower, and your opponents are going to really be stretched thin in deciding which card they're going to have to defend first. Finally, it's extremely important to remember to use your supporting spells on offense. The reason that arrows and fireball are the two spells is that they can instantly take out any sort of small to medium health unit. If the opponent has swarms, make sure to always save your arrows for that graveyard, and alternatively save that fireball if your opponent has any sort of heavier type of unit. Overall, this deck has such a solid defense, and combining that with its high counter push ability, it is definitely a deadly deck for this current meta.